We continue this morning in a series we started last Sunday entitled Weakness Under Grace. And it's designed to be a series that sort of balances suffering, sickness or terminal sickness, disabilities, slight or severe, depression. I mean, it covers a lot of these things and balances it with God, our Creator. That's it. Thank you. Last week we began with the problem, and the problem that we observed was that there are voices in our culture, and these voices, they've been in our culture for a while, they've been in our world for a while, but they get louder, and if they're not balanced with a different voice, if they're not balanced with a different message, pretty soon their answer becomes the standard. And we can't allow, as God's people, this to happen, at least without offering a different voice. What the voices in our world, what they're offering is an alternative to suffering, to sickness, to disabilities, to being unhappy. And their alternative is death. If you feel like you're not productive, if you feel like you don't meet whatever mark or level that you need to have to be happy in this life because of suffering, because of sickness, because of a disability, then an alternative, they say, is death. Now, we looked at how this was used on a very wide scale with Hitler and his T4 program, what we know as his euthanasia program, where Hitler empowered the physicians, his physicians, to make a judgment call on life. If a person was too old, too disabled, too mentally challenged to continue to live, then the doctor had the authority to terminate that life. And he called it in his official order a mercy killing. We also observed last week how this type of voice has continued in our nation by some of the smartest folks we have. Dr. Watson, a Nobel Prize-winning doctor, the co-discoverer of the double helix in our DNA, a very intelligent man, argues that if we would just redefine life to begin 3 days after birth, then parents, along with the doctor, could determine if there's any kind of abnormality or any type of disability that shows up in 3 days, and the parents feel that this would just be too much of a burden, that we could end that baby's life before it becomes a life. We also observed last week how in 1982 this became a reality. It became something real in our nation. In Indiana, a baby was born with Down syndrome, and the parents were just overwhelmed with what was about to happen and what they were about to have to go through to raise this child. They petitioned the court, and the court agreed that the hospital could allow this child to die of neglect and starvation. These are the voices that keep a constant mantra, an alternative, that if life's too difficult, if you feel too disabled, if you're struggling from some sickness or life-changing illness, then an alternative is death. But we also noticed last week that that's not the case with God. With God, every life matters. And that's rule one as we're moving through this series. The first, I don't know if it's a rule, it's a principle, it's a guiding standard. But the very first one is every life matters to God. We get that in Genesis. At the very, very beginning, when God created the world, He created the sky and the stars, and He said, this is good. He created the animals, and He said, this is good. Created the land and the sea, and He said, this is good. And then one day He created man and woman, and He did something a little different. Remember, He put the stars in the sky and the fish in the sea, but He put in man and woman His image. Very different from all the other creatures in the world and all the other things He created. He put His image in humanity, and then He stepped back and said, this is very good. Because we have God's image in us, every life matters. Even from the womb, every life matters. So that's the first sort of guiding principle. This morning we're going to be introduced to a second one. Now I'll tell you, this is a complicated and sort of a complex topic. I am aware of that. It's a very difficult topic, which is why this is the first time I've ever done this. After this morning, we will have an intermission for 2 weeks to let you catch your thoughts. And then we'll pick it up in 2 weeks. We'll finish. But I'm aware there are exceptions. I mean, there's always exceptions. But I'm not going to preach the exception. I'm not going to teach the exception. You pray about it. Come to grips with it with God. If you need my help, I'll help you. But what I'm teaching and preaching is the standard. It's the rule. It's the guide. Certainly there are degrees. Certainly there are exceptions. And we can think of some very difficult cases which is going to cause us all to struggle. But what I'm offering is the guiding principle. The other voice that needs to be speaking to people in our world and in our culture, that there's another alternative. And it begins with the first principle, you matter. Every life matters to God because God creates us in His image. Now, I've got a picture. I'm going to start this picture around, maybe by the time it gets back around, we'll be ready for the illustration, though I doubt it. It'll probably just get down to this side. But as the picture comes around, just look at it. This is going to be one of my illustrations this morning. We begin with Jacob. Jacob is a very prominent character in the Old Testament. Jacob is somebody I imagine most of us know, especially from Sunday school. Jacob is who the Jews trace the birth of their nation back to this one man, Jacob. His 12 sons become the 12 tribes of Israel, and in the text we read this morning, his name even changes from Jacob to Israel. Very prominent character in the Old Testament. But his full story is it's odd. It's checkered. It's a little strange. It's a little different. If you remember his story, this is a twin brother to Esau, the two boys born to Isaac. Now these are big names, big characters in the Old Testament. This is heavy folks we're looking at this morning. Something was a little odd or different about Jacob, though. Even from the beginning, even from the birth, you get a sense that he's up to something. He's always just he's working on his own little plan, seems to be. And as you step back and look at his story, you fast forward his story up to the point he leaves home, he actually takes his family's blessing from his brother by pretending to be his brother. So through deception, lying, and cheating, he begins to make his own path by his own hands and by his own plan and agenda. Jacob is going to be the master of his own destiny. He will be in control. Well, he begins running from his brother because he thinks his brother's going to kill him. Fast forward the story a little more. His brothers found him, and he's on his way to meet him. And it's the night before they meet. Something really bizarre happens in the story. Jacob wrestles with something, and as a result of this incident, his life is changed forever. And this is why the Jews and the Israelites trace their birth back to this moment. It's transformational, very important. As a result of this incident, two things happened that changed his life. Those two things is what we're looking at this morning. First was he was permanently disabled. His hip was knocked out of socket, and he walked with a limp the rest of his life. This is sort of ironic from a fellow who spent most of his life running, that all of a sudden now you're barely going to be able to walk. Stop running and listen. So he was permanently disabled, and the other thing that happened, he received a blessing, purpose in life. Now, as a result of those two things, we have before us the model or the foundation for our second standard in struggling with this issue of disabilities, of hardships, of illnesses, and of sickness. God teaches us through Jacob's story. This is important. God teaches us through Jacob's story that we have purpose not despite a weakness or disability, but because of a weakness or disability. Let me say that again. God teaches us through Jacob and this very important character in the Old Testament that we have purpose not despite our weaknesses or our disabilities, but because of them. Put it another way, God uses us and our disabilities and our weaknesses as a blessing. Now, this is seen in its most, there's several points here. I want to give you one. This is seen as its most profound way in this sense. Purpose in life comes from God, not ability. One of the most foundational teachings in this text is Jacob was disabled before he was blessed. He spent all his life master of his own destiny, doing his own thing, making his own mark, doing it his way. He spent all his life moving in that direction, and the other half running from what he had done. But the point is, he was going to do it himself. Then he was broken. And then God said, "Now I'll bless you." The point together from that in the series that we're in is this. Purpose and blessings in life come from God, not our ability. The picture that's going around is of Ethan. First time I'd ever gone to the Special Olympics was in Florida. And I went with a group of sailors. We were there as, in different capacities. My capacity was to take Ethan around to the different events that he had signed up for. The event that the picture was taken was the obstacle course. Now, I was explaining to Ethan in the shot that went around what he had to do, a plan for you to beat the other guys in the wheelchairs. Ethan, here's how I think you ought to do this. And we were developing a plan about how he was going to go through the obstacles and race the other folks in wheelchairs. And as I began talking to him, I saw in his eyes more life, more joy, more passion than I have on most mornings. And I walked out of that event supposed to be a helper, and I walked out the one that was helped. I learned humility and blessings in a very profound and meaningful way. I get frustrated when it rains too much, or when my car, something's wrong with it and it's got to go to the shop. Frustrates me. Or when I've got my week planned out and things come up that require my attention. Ethan has to have help to get from his bed to his wheelchair every day. His legs don't work. Part of his upper body doesn't work, but he has enough to maneuver a little joystick to move his wheelchair. But he had more joy and life in him than I have on most of my good days. How is that possible? What is his purpose? What is his meaning in life? I have no idea. What is your purpose and meaning in life? Don't know. But I know this, it's not from your ability. We do not get our purpose and meaning in life from our ability, from what you're able to do. So many folks come to me, Pastor, I'd love to help out here, but I decided I'm not gifted to do that. In some way, that tells me that's actually where God's calling you. Because in a weird way, He takes the people not gifted to do things. Let me give you another example. This one ought to be really close to you because it's about me. I have never shared this with any congregation. The family's the only people who know this, and whoever's going to be watching TV tonight. You all have been impressed with the way, the style, the fact that I don't stand behind the pulpit. You've shared this with me. You've said, it's just a little different, it's a little refreshing. Well, I got to tell the secret is I can't stand there. In middle school, I was tested for dyslexia. I am dyslexic. I have a bigger problem reading in public than I do speaking in public. So what I and the world sees as a minor disability and a weakness, you have seen all along as a blessing. And God has used it as a blessing. I have to find ways to overcome the fact that I don't read very well in public. So you will not find me reading from a manuscript because I can't, not because I don't want to. It just feels awkward. And I'm not going to get out what I need to get out. I'm not comparing myself to Ethan or any other illness or disability that any of us share in life. I'm simply saying our purpose and meaning doesn't come from our ability. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. I need to pick a different profession. But God called me to do this. And often I get up on Sunday and I think, why have you called me, someone who struggles with something, especially in public, to do something that requires me to do that in public? So when you hand me announcements on pieces of paper, you now know why I don't read those. I know what the words are, but if you know about dyslexia, you know what it is. It's something happens in the translation. And you get frustrated, especially in public. So I'd like to be there, but I'm not. Now you see that as a blessing, I see it as a weakness. The point I'm wanting you to hear is that our purpose, your purpose in life does not come from your ability to do anything. Purpose and meaning come from God alone. So before we line up behind these voices who at times seem to be compassionate, at times seem to make a little bit of sense, we ought to be mindful of Jacob, who presents us with the second standard. A different voice. I think folks like Ethan, those that have a terminal illness, those that have a permanent disability, need to hear a different voice in our culture. One that doesn't say, if you don't meet some magic line, then our culture says, maybe you ought to think about killing yourself. But one that says, you matter. Every life matters because you were created in the image of God. One that says, you know what, it really doesn't matter what you're able to do or not able to do. That's not where you get purpose and meaning in life anyway. Purpose and meaning in life come from God. Where do we find that? In the story, an old story of a very important figure in history, Jacob, who left God with two things. The text says it was a man. Most of Christians and scholars say it was an angel. Our bulletin cover is of Jacob and an angel. But Jacob says it was God. Who did he wrestle with? I don't know. But here's what I do know. He left with two things: a permanent disability and purpose and a blessing. And they both came from God. As odd and paradoxical as that sounds, they both came from God. Now, what do we do with a loving God and sickness, or brokenness, or disease? Well, in 2 weeks, we'll look at that. For now, know that we have two standards, two principles, two ideals. The first is that every life matters, and the second is our purpose doesn't come from our ability anyway. Purpose comes from God, not your ability. Next week and the week after, we'll move into something a little different. Next Sunday is Communion Sunday. We'll have something a little different for you that Sunday morning. I haven't done that before, but we're going to do something a little different next week. We're going to talk about Christian community, helping one another, our brothers and sisters in Christ, and even those who are not our brothers and sisters in Christ. And then the week after is Mother's Day. We'll do a focus on that, and then we'll pick this back up later in May. But this week and next week, I want you to pray, and I want you to think, and I want you to ponder and reflect and struggle with this topic. I know it's not easy, and I know that there are probably exceptions. But what I'm preaching and teaching is the rule, not the exception. Every life matters, and our purpose comes from God, not our ability. Let us pray.